Okay, let's get started, everyone. All right, so just to remind you guys where we were talking about land issues. And in the previous lecture, we talked about moral hazard issues and how do we think about moral hazard in land. And the second kind of piece of the land puzzle that I want to talk about today is about land titling and sort of the impacts of land titling. Okay, so that's going to be the main thing today. So there's a few other things I just wanted to finish up on land, on sort of the moral hazard stuff first. So I think we basically finished the discussion of the experimental paper. The last thing I just wanted to mention was, if you think about sort of the theoretical models that I outlined last time, we talked about both moral hazard models and limited liability models, like sort of insurance kind of motives and limited liability sort of challenges. And you might want to kind of distinguish between those two, right? And here I don't know of a super great paper that does that, so I just wanted to sort of mention this because it seems like a natural thing that you'd like to sort of distinguish between those two. There's a paper by Lafont and Matussi that sort of thinks about this. This is, as far as I know, the original limited liability sharecropping kind of paper. At least the best, whenever you say original, it's always a risk if someone finds something from before that. That's the one I know of. But in their paper, sort of the idea, the way they think about this, they think about this idea of working capital. Okay, so working capital is money that you have sort of available to you, right, in the short run, for buying things like paying your rent or buying your fertilizer inputs or whatever. And their idea is that working capital is is the thing that's going to determine the limited liability constraint, right, for how much you can pay up front. So in their model, they basically say instead of saying L has to be greater than 0, they put in this constraint that the amount that you pay, this is L is the payment in the low state, if you remember from the model we had last time. So L greater than K, then the higher K, the more the contract looks like a rental contract rather than a sharecropping contract. So that's fine. Whereas in a risk aversion model, then what should matter is your total wealth, not just the amount of liquid kind of assets you have. Okay? So that's kind of the test they use to sort of argue for limited liability. So what do you think of this as a test? It's a good idea, bad idea? What do you think? It's plausible, not plausible? Yeah, Aaron.
Well, wouldn't we think that wealth is pretty highly correlated with working capital?
Yeah, but suppose you could measure them both.
I guess, don't we also think that risk aversion is decreasing in wealth? So that,
No, that's the idea, exactly, right? So risk aversion should be decreasing. So the idea of the test is risk aversion should be, if it's a risk aversion model, then kind of, the determinants of whatever, of sharecropping or whatever, should be your total wealth, right? Because that's, in a risk aversion model, well, I'm not going to try to write it down quickly because I'll get it wrong. But your utility is a function of your total consumption. Your total consumption is a function of your total wealth, right? And you can use your total wealth to kind of smooth your consumption choices. So that's kind of what's driving risk aversion. That's why risk aversion should be a function of total wealth, whereas the limited liability is you have cash you sort of need to pay. So yes, exactly. The idea is if it's a function of total wealth, it should be the risk aversion model. If it's a function of the limited liability, they're going to argue it's if it's a function of working capital, they're going to argue it's the limited liability model. So what else do you think? Good idea? Not good idea? If I were to put up the results, do you think this is a good test? Yeah.
No, I was just going to ask, is it clear those two things are different? So, if someone has no savings, if a household is poor and doesn't have no savings, all the...
That's true, but again, that's sort of a related question to Aaron. So suppose I can run a regression. Suppose I get data, right, and I run sharecropping is equal to alpha k plus beta w plus epsilon, where this is working capital, and this thing is your total wealth, right? So to run this regression, number one, I have to be able to measure these two things separately, and number two, I have to have some variation. So you're right, for some households they'll be the same, but those aren't the ones who are going to identify this thing. I mean, if everyone sort of looked like that, then you wouldn't be able to run this regression. So this is going to be identified off of some households that have different amounts of working capital and some households with different amounts of wealth. So yes, some of them will have none of anything, but then some must have some wealth and not much working capital, and some must have some working capital and not enough wealth. That's what's going to identify this regression. So suppose you can run this regression and you get some coefficients alpha and beta. Like, what do you think that tells you? Or is it like a good test or not a good test? Yeah, Kailash, what do you think?
Like, why do we think that working capital is this good measure of limited liability? Like,
sorry, you guys.
Sorry. Like, why do we think working capital is like the limit of? Like, couldn't someone be taken to court and get total wealth extracted?
Yeah. So right. So number one is it could go the other way, right? So could be like, if you have wealth, you could go to court and get the wealth, right? Could. Right? So that's one reason. So I agree with you. So in certainly a well-functioning legal system, absolutely, they go after your total assets. They can make you sell liquid assets or whatever. And so that's one thing. What else? Yeah, Ahmed.
They are naturally correlated, and I would assume total wealth is measured with much more error than working capital.
Yeah. So actually, I'm not sure I agree with that. But you're right that there could be measurement error. And they're correlated and there could be measurement error. So I agree that's going to be a problem for sort of interpreting this regression. So it's all kind of related to the measurement issues. But the reason I'm not sure I agree is actually your total wealth, like most of it's in your land, that might be relatively easy to value compared to actually adding up your working capital. It may be sort of hard to find that. People might not. So it's not obvious to me which is a better measure.
Because we are controlling for both. We are adding both.
Yes, I agree. So if you have measurement error in one, if one thing is measured poorly and they're correlated, that could be a problem in this regression. Yeah, Shauna?
I don't have the idea quite pinned down, but I feel like having no working capital would make me more risk averse.
Yeah, so why? Tell me more about that.
Well, it's just like, it just seems like it seems like that, I don't know, it just seems like there's the direct relationship.
Yeah.
I don't know, is that, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the second thing I think is a potential challenge with this regression. Actually, I agree with you. So if you think about if you take any behavioral economics, you'll see that people make all kinds of risk aversion decisions based on things that don't look like, the standard economic model says you should be making, what should matter is your total wealth, because that's going to affect the degree you can kind of smooth your consumption from period to period, or you're just be directly risk averse over your total wealth. But we know people make all kinds of decisions that look like they're not like that, right? So we know that people sort of think about cash on hand. They they make decisions over sort of much smaller lotteries. So it's, I think, very easy to think that sort of if I have some cash on hand that's very liquid and then a bunch of stuff that's illiquid, I might be thinking about the sort of liquid piece when I'm making my sort of thinking about my risk aversion decisions, even though our good economic model says that shouldn't be the case. So I think that's exactly sort of the second set of concerns here. There's also a non-behavioral economic story to that, which is just like if there are costs of taking the sort of non-working capital piece of my wealth that's like not liquid, like I own a lot of land. Yes, I own that, but actually there could be some costs of sort of using that for consumption smoothing, and even sort of straightforward economic model might say that actually the working capital is more liquid, and therefore I'm going to be more risk averse. So my risk aversion will be determined by that piece, not the overall wealth. So I think both of these are challenged with this test. They find that the low working capital is more predictive than total wealth, and they argue that's an evidence of sharecropping. But I think these are some reasons why you might not think this is the final word on that. And I just wanted to sort of think that through, because I think that's this test is an example of sort of taking the theory super duper seriously, and sort of but I think for the reasons that we talked about, actually it's not totally obvious. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Okay, other questions? All right. Oh, and the final thing I wanted to say about this is, as I mentioned, I think that there are important implications of these two different models for a land reform, right? So, as we talked about, under a limited liability, right, this could have a really big long-run effect. A land reform could have a really big long-run effect because it relaxes kind of your liability constraint. You don't have to pay anybody, right? Right? Under risk aversion, it would. You might have less risk aversion because you're now wealthier because you don't own the land, right? So on a pure risk aversion story, you would be a little bit richer. But on the other hand, if you're still risk averse, sharecropping might again kind of emerge endogenously as a way of ensuring some of the risk that you're still sort of faced against. So that is this prediction that it would be really interesting to sort of see what happens. Like if we do a land reform, does this kind of institution emerge endogenously again, or not? And sort of how does that happen? And that's not a paper that I think that there's a great paper on. More generally, I think that if you think about the paper we saw about moral hazard, another prediction of a land reform is that it should lead to substantial productivity improvements, right? So this one in some sense is about sort of how do we share kind of what's going. So it would do several things. Number one is a land reform should sort of make if you're just giving the land, if you're just redistributing it, that should make people richer. Number two, this is unclear what's going to happen to sort of the form of the contract. Number three, if there's moral hazard going on and you don't end up back in the sort of the share arrangement, then you might think there's going to be substantial increases in output. Yeah, Kyle, should look like you have a question or no? Okay, it's a little hard to tell people without the math on, but okay. So it would be really nice, I think, to understand what the implications of land reform are. And my own view is that I feel like there is an awesome land reform paper waiting to be written. And in particular, first of all, there were a lot more failed land reforms than successful land reforms, right? There was a huge amount of political pushback against land reform for sort of, I think, obvious reasons, like the people who were going to get their land taken away from them were A, upset, and B, wealthy, and so it's not totally surprising they were able to push back. So a lot of them didn't work, but some of them did, at least a few. At least I think there were some, examples. And so some of them had sharp discontinuities in the amount of land people could retain, like up to 1 hectare, up to 5 hectares, or whatever. So it feels like you should be able to, if you had the right data, I could imagine you could sort of match, if you had pre-period data on sort of what land parcels were, and you could somehow match everything, you could find discontinuities in pre-period data, you could try to do that. And then you could sort of watch what happened, both to the people who got wealthier, to the land, did it get more productive, to the contract form, all that stuff. So there's a paper by Kitamura in Japan, which sort of tries something similar to this, but without the microdata. They have to sort of aggregate things up. There's a paper, Jonas Tukuri, who's a grad student actually on the job market this year, tried at some point to study this in Finland. For some reason, it didn't work out. I don't remember why. I, working with a grad student a number of years ago, spent a summer, or this particular student spent a summer working with me, looking around for examples all around the world of examples where we had could find the discontinuity and the land reform that happened and the data, and we didn't come up with any. But I'm just going to leave this out here as like something I would like to see a paper on. Because an important part of like a PhD class is like not just showing you the papers that have been written, but sort of mentioning papers that haven't been written yet, because that's kind of course, the goal. So anyway, some related studies. Here are two that came out sort of relatively recently that are sort of related. There's also sort of a paper by Abhijit and co-authors looking at a tenancy reform in West Bengal, which basically, as I understand it, gave existing sharecrop people greater protections and greater rights, but didn't actually change sort of totally go all the way to the form of ownership. But that is another one you can look at. There's a paper by Galan, which is a study of Colombia, which looks at people who were there was this program that sort of provided land for the poor. So this is closer. I don't think it's quite the same for a variety of reasons, but I'll mention this one as one you should look at. There's also a paper by Montero, which is an RD on that haciendas, sort of large haciendas, were reorganized into worker cooperatives. But of course, worker cooperatives is not the same as sort of divvying everything up kind of individually to the individual workers. So these papers are sort of closer and sort of interested, and I would recommend these plus the sort of West Bengal paper, all of these in the West Bengal paper if you're sort of interested in this topic. Okay. That's what I want to say on moral hazard and land reform before I move on to land titling. Any last questions or comments? Okay. So the discussion thus far, yeah.
Very good question. So what happens if in any of these land reforms, what you're doing is you're giving property rights to some group of people, are they then required to farm that land, or can they become landlords themselves?
I think it depends.
Okay. I think that would.
But I'm going to talk about some of this. Yeah, I think it would depend. That would be one of the things you could study in principle. But that's also kind of related to the to some of these other questions. Like, if, you know, in the or could they choose to become sharecroppers again? You know, would they choose to sort of sell the land, pocket the money, or exit farming entirely? Like maybe another thing they could do is they could sell the land and move to the city, right? So you know, there's lots. If you have that kind of complete ownership, you know, you can do what you want with it. But in many cases, but in some cases, no. And actually, that understanding of whether or not, whether you get the land and it's fully sellable and transferable, versus you get the land but you can't get rid of it, has huge implications, right? Because you might decide you don't want to be a farmer anymore, and so the efficient thing to do is sell the farm and move to the city. But like if you're tied to the land, then you can be stuck with that. And I'm going to talk about some related issues in the land titling section right now, actually. Okay. So the discussion thus far has been about contract type, essentially, own versus rent, and the implications kind of for moral hazard. But what I want to talk about now is this idea that, this is kind of related actually to this point, conditional on kind of owning, there are different degrees of ownership, right? And those can matter in really important ways. And in particular, many people in many developing countries do not have well-protected formal titles to their land. Okay, so you know, when you think of like, you know, a land title, you probably think of a deed that sort of says like, this is my land, and I can, like, if I want to sell the house, sell it or mortgage it or whatever, like that piece of paper saying this is the land, this is my title to the land is really important, right? And so if you don't have formal title to your land, right, maybe you own it, but it's kind of some informal understanding that you kind of own it, that can create all kinds of distortions. For example, it might have reduced investment. So for example, you know, if I don't know that I own the land forever, then I might not want to put a lot of fixed investments into my land because I could be worried that I'm going to get expropriated and sort of lose the returns to that investment. I may have to put in costly effort to prevent expropriation. So for example, I may have to stick around. Like, you know, if I own the land and I have clear title to it, I can go work in the city and be confident that my land will still be there and still be owned to me. If my title is not great, I may actually have to be there to prevent someone else from coming and taking it, right? So there are things you have to do, and we're going to talk about all these, but this is an overview. Another is misallocation, right? So if you think about the Coase theorem, which if you guys have heard of the Coase theorem, yes, no? I always assume that everyone's, sometimes I assume that everyone's heard of everything, but of course then what would be the point of having the class? So, in the Coase theorem idea basically says if we have good formal transferable property rights, then the property should end up being, you know, owned by sort of the person who's the most efficient owner, right? And if we have a transfer, if we have full ownership in markets, we'll be able to do that because if I have a higher value of the land than you do, I'll offer to buy the land for more, and eventually the land will get allocated to people with sort of the highest value of the land. But if I can't sell the land, then we could end up in a world with misallocation. And kind of people who are sort of not particularly good farmers or whatever may end up owning the land because they can't sell it to people who are better farmers. And the fourth one is that I can't either sell or mortgage the property you know, or use it for other transactions. So, you know, if you ever, none of you have, I suspect none of you have bought a house yet. But when you do someday, you will probably get a mortgage, and the mortgage basically says, I pledge, there's actually two documents in the U.S. at least if you buy a house. One is a loan saying which is actually, as I discovered when I bought a house, the short document, which basically says I owe the bank, X thousand dollars. Then the more complicated document is the mortgage, which basically says, and if I don't pay the loan, you can take my house. And I'm pledging the house as collateral for the loan. And the idea is that sort of the ability to sort of have good titles is important because then you can sort of use them as collateral for loans, and it sort of can relax your credit constraints, right? And there was a big argument by DeSoto in I think the late 80s, early 90s or so, which was basically arguing that sort of the lack of formal title was creating a lot of credit constraints and sort of putting limitations on people's ability to borrow. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is like what do we know about all this stuff? And in some sense, kind of DeSoto kind of was saying this is a huge problem, and then there was all this like evidence, like work trying to sort of understand it. And you'll see kind of where I think we are on some of this stuff. Okay, questions, overview? Yeah, no, good, great, okay. So as an aside, let me just say that the institutions of property rights are complicated, okay? And by this, I'm going to give you an example as follows. So suppose you were buying a house, okay, and someone offered you, in exchange for all the thousands of dollars, what's called a quitclaim deed. A quitclaim deed, this is a definition that I got from Wikipedia. A quitclaim deed says the following. The owner or grantor of this deed terminates or quits any right or claim to the property, thereby allowing the right or the claim to transfer to the person you're granting it to. But unlike most other property deeds, a quitclaim deed contains no title covenant and thus does not offer any guarantee or warranty as to the status of the title. So the grantee is entitled only to whatever interest the grantor actually may or may not possess at the time of the transfer, right? So this means that the person issuing this deed does not guarantee that he or she actually owns the property, or if she does, that there's no one else has a claim on the property. It's just sort of saying, this deed basically says, if I happen to own anything in this property, whatever I may or may not own, it's yours. Okay? So would you buy that house? What do you think? No. Okay, anyone else?
Well, if you have some mechanism of verifying what they own, like a central registry, then that's kind of...
Right. Okay, so I think this, like Salome, when I first read this, I thought this sounded insane. Okay, why would I possibly do this? Turns out every deed, essentially 95% of deeds in the state of Massachusetts, including my house, come with this form of deed. Okay, and why is that? And why does this possibly work? So I think, as you were sort of saying, Rekha, it's not the quitclaim deed in isolation. So what basically happens is, so we here in Massachusetts have very good land records, but not perfect land records. Okay, so when you buy the quitclaim deed, you can go, or your lawyer can go and go to the registry of deeds and search the history of quitclaim deeds back to your house, and they can say, well, so and so has a quitclaim deed from some previous person, previously so and so forth. So it looks like maybe there's something kind of going on there that gives you reasonably good assurance that the person who's giving you the deed probably owns the house. And if not, you also buy title insurance. So when you buy a house, at least here, you have to buy insurance against the fact that maybe they don't actually own the house. Okay, and it's a small enough risk because of the pretty good information that actually that insurance is not, I don't think it's particularly competitively priced, I will say, but I think that insurance is not, that expensive compared to the cost of the house because, as you were saying, Rekha, they have pretty good information, so this is a pretty small risk. So the only point I'm sort of making is that actually, first of all, I just love this example because I still can't get over the fact that this is how this actually works. But I think the broader point here is it's not just, you have to think about the whole kind of set of institutions kind of in their entirety and how all the sort of different pieces of them work together. This kind of not super great deed, works kind of reasonably well as part of sort of a three-part process where you have these like reasonable deeds, very good records, and title insurance for kind of the third piece of it. And so, you know, I think the institutional details are really important, and if you try to understand them, they're important for understanding them, and if you're ever going to do anything in this context. Another thing, which by the way is also kind of, let me make one other sort of general institutional point. You may think that why would there be any possible downside to land titling, right? It seems like of course we should issue kind of really good titles. However, let me just point out that the process of actually going through and titling land is very, very complicated. So if you're in a world with informal kind of boundaries or whatever, and you're going to title them, everyone understands that whatever titles get marked down and delineated are going to be the actual land border definitions kind of now and forever. And so every possible dispute over every possible border kind of has to be adjudicated and settled before kind of the titling is done. So you might imagine that there's lots of borders that, you know, we don't actually need to sort of really worry about. It's kind of like, you know, we have our land and there's kind of some forest in between and we kind of know roughly kind of where the thing is. And that's like fine for, you know, for a lot of, for us, because you and I don't actually particularly care whether the border is like on this side of the table or like a foot over here on this side of the table, because like it's approximately the border and we're good, right? It seems like it's fine. But if the government is going to come on and say like this is the answer, every single one of those disputes has to be adjudicated. So in some sense, you move from a world where disputes are only adjudicated in the sort of small set of cases where they actually matter to a world where you have to actually adjudicate everything kind of up front, and that could be costly. I'm not saying, by the way, it's not worth it. I'm just saying it's worth kind of thinking those things through. There are other sort of issues that if you are interested in this stuff get kind of complicated. For example, another reason why we have these quick, crazy deeds in Massachusetts is there's a common law principle called adverse possession, which basically means if I'm using land for a certain number of years and no one has explicitly given me permission to use it, nor stop me from using it, I just kind of do it and nobody sort of says anything. After a certain number of years, that land actually becomes mine. That's sort of a common law principle. And so actually another reason we have these crazy deeds, we don't know actually what's happened with all that kind of like usage stuff. And in fact, there may be sort of reasonable reasons to have those kind of things to sort of formally recognize kind of things that have been happening kind of over time. So my only point is, I actually think that the details of how do you do all this titling are probably a lot more complicated than you might at first think of, like, oh, it's your house, I sent you a little deed, write it down, like, we're done. Like, the actual process of doing that is interesting, and I suspect there's probably some interesting and good research to be done on the details of how do you do that. Like, there could be really interesting papers on sort of the adjudication process. I at one point wanted to do a paper on the adjudication process and how do you actually get communities to agree on sort of what the titles are, and maybe are there different, you know, how does kind of the political environment sort of affect kind of that adjudication process? Like, I think there's lots of interesting stuff there. So I just wanted to sort of mention that before I sort of talk about a bit about what we know. Yeah, Kailash.
When you're thinking about this and the risk aversion, limited liability stuff, is it like that we are sure that land is being used inefficiently in developing countries, and we're trying to figure out why that is, or is it like there are these problems in it?
I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. So let's come back to that at the end of this lecture and see. Let me see if some of the papers I'm going to answer answer some of your questions, because there are going to be at least a few that are going to show inefficiency. Yeah, Ishan, do you have a question? No? Great. All right. So now I want to talk about kind of the four, after my little aside, about institutions, the four sort of pieces here. What are the impacts on investment, on effort to prevent expropriation, misallocation, which is a bit kind of related to what you were saying, well, not, sorry, inability to sell, and inability for collateral. I think all of these actually, in some sense, are trying to answer versions of the efficiency consequences question, right? Not only one of them is like, do the wrong people own it? But all these are saying on net, does all this stuff have inefficiency consequences? Not necessarily because of moral hazard, but in general. Sorry, and I think the other answer to your question, I think the point of that QJE paper that we read last time was that that does sort of show the efficiency consequences of the sharecropping arrangements associated, right? Right. That was kind of the point. So, okay, all right. So the first thing I want to talk about is investment, and how does investment change with better property rights? So Goldstein et al. Are going to study a land demarcation paper in Benin. Now note, this is not the titling piece. This is the demarcation piece. Okay, so I don't think they actually then fully title everything, but they're just going through the where exactly are the borders piece, and let's all agree on that. Okay, so but you can think of this as part of the process of moving towards clarifying property rights. Okay, so there's an expectation this will form the basis of a future property titling, but they haven't actually done that at the time of the study. Now, what I want to talk about for a sec here is this experimental design. So take a minute and have a look at this, and if you can't read it, hopefully you still have your handout from last time because it's reproduced in the handout. I want to compare the experimental design they did on the left with the experimental design that one could have done on the right. And I will put as an aside, I put this up there because I put this once as an exam question, and I felt like people did not fully know the answer, so I decided to go in the lecture rather than on the exam. So what do you think? What's the difference between these two experimental designs? So what's different about these two experimental designs? So it's a randomized experiment, right? We're going to randomize these two different, we're going to randomize villages into getting this kind of land titling treatment or not. And let's forget about this, I don't remember what this Emmy Cove thing is exactly. Let's forget about this. I think it's actually not essential to this. So it's not essential. So what's the difference between these two designs? Oh yeah, right, go ahead. Or Christine, sorry, I hadn't heard you in a while. Go ahead.
In the left hand, you're working only with villages that are interested. And on the right hand, you are working with villages that are both interested and not interested?
No. Well, not really. So what do you mean working with?
I mean, you select, treated, and control people only from a subset of people that self-selected and being interested in this design?
On the left one, yeah.
Yes. And on the right hand, you have controls that could be either interested or not.
Right.
And treated people that are interested or not interested.
Correct. Yes, I think that is the main difference. Anyone else? Any other differences? Rick, were you saying something with that or something similar? Same thing or different?
I guess, yeah, you might only be interested in the population of villages that are interested and informed anyway. So if you're looking to find a treatment effect for the population, that might be interesting population.
Okay, yeah, so that might be about interesting population. Yeah, Paolo, what are you going to say?
The last piece is the eligibility part. So on the left-hand side, there are eligible villages that are interested, that are stratified then into treatment and control groups. Mm-hmm. Whereas on the left-hand side, once you're in the treatment group, if you're interested and eligible, you're always going to be treated.
You're always going to what, sorry?
You're always going to be treated if you are interested and eligible and got moderated into treatment at the initial stage.
Yeah, so how we deal with interest and how we deal with eligibility, we deal with them at different stages of this design. And before, okay. So now my next question, so that's the key difference. So which is better? Which is the better design? Well, this is puzzle.
One on the left seems better.
So, sorry, what were you going to say?
Doesn't that depend on what effect you are trying to estimate? Because treatment group is the same. Control groups will be different.
Okay, so Ahmed says maybe it depends on what you're going to estimate. Reiko, why do you think the left one's better?
So you are, the classification of knowing what types of people are in the control group, you just totally don't know because you're not measuring this.
Right, we don't know who's over here.
Yeah. And also you're getting pretty intense selection effects on the right side.
Okay, so when you say selection effects, what do you mean? So does this give you the right? Are both these designs internally valid? So let me ask you a
Based
question.
on, like,
So do these designs differ in terms of their internal validity or external validity? Let me ask those more specific questions. I'm sorry, Patrick, your hand up. Sorry.
I mean, it was just addressing which one was better.
What's that?
It was just addressing which one was better.
Which one?
I think that if power is not an issue, I would say the right-hand side.
Okay, but we gotta live in a finite world. So which one do you think? So we got a finite number. We got a finite number. Whoops, we got a finite number of villages. Let's suppose we have 600 villages over here, or 1,000 villages. Finite number of villages. So, sorry, what was
I'm wondering, like, for the right-hand side, are we going to just calculate average differences in treatment?
What's it? Sorry, you guys speak louder. What?
Oh, for the right-hand side, are we just going to calculate the average differences between the treatment and control, or we'll slide the control group into actually a node? They're never uniforms.
Well, so how are we going to estimate this? So let's, so on the left-hand one, we can run y equals alpha treat plus epsilon. And on the right-hand one, we could run an IV regression, right? Because not everyone on the right-hand one, not everyone lotteried into treatment will ultimately get treated. So that's a nice case to run IV, right? So we can run IV of where we can run like y equals alpha treat, alpha get the treat, get treatment plus epsilon, and we can run, and we can use the lottery as an instrument. Okay, so my first question is, like, are these different in terms of internal validity? So, like, I think the things we want to think about are like, so one is like, are these internally valid? Right? The second is like, external validity, or like what late does alpha estimate? And three is what's the power? What's the statistical power here? Okay. Yeah, Ahmed?
Very bad question. What determines eligibility and non-eligibility?
Who knows? So, let's just say it's something. I don't remember. Let's say it's something that you can only investigate if you go in and like go to the village and like do some and talk to people and do some stuff. So let's just say it requires some digging around to figure out. Yeah, Reka.
So I think on 2,
Yeah.
it kind of is contingent on whether you think that like this policy could be implemented in the event that a village wasn't interested, and also what drives a village being interested or not. So if you think that it's just going to be like categorically impossible to ever implement this in a population where people are not interested in taking up the treatment, then like it's not interesting to you, like what would like measuring the effect in that population, because it's like you can't implement that policy.
So I agree. So you're right. So it's not if you could never implement this policy in villages that weren't interested, then the late is not interesting. The late of like what would be the average treatment effect in the entire population is not a relevant late. What, you saying something else?
Oh, yeah.
But sorry, wait, another question though. So does the left-hand side and the right-hand side, do they estimate the same late or different lates?
Are you dropping the population of, like, are you including when villages say that they're not interested in the not treated group?
Here?
On the right-hand side. Control group?
Yeah, of course, right? So how do we estimate, how do we run this regression? Okay, so how do we run this regression? So in this regression, let's forget about the eligibles, whatever, just to make the life more simple. I take these people over here, only these people, and run a regression on treatment and control. In this one, I have to condition on when I randomize, right? So I take all these people, and I compare them to all these people. So I have data. So I do all that. So that's using the regression.
So they're not measuring the same, right?
So they're not measuring the same length. Why?
Because first you've cleaved into only villages that are interested and informed, and then your treated versus control population is going to be conditional on being interested and informed. In the other case, you're looking at all villages, and then you're just inducing a incentive to get treated, and comparing that against a control population that's includes people who are not interested.
Yeah. So it is definitely the case that the sample here is very different, right? This includes all the people who are interested or not interested. Does anyone disagree? You disagree? Yes? No? Okay. Yeah, Paolo.
But then if you do the classic IB thing of how many of the people actually took it up, then you get the weight exactly for the people who took it up, don't you?
Yeah, so say more.
So if you take the average for the alternative design, the difference between the left branch and the right branch, and then you divide it by the percent of people who took up the treatment, then you would get the coefficient for the treatment effect for the people who decided to take up the program, or the villages.
Right. So actually, these are so I actually agree with you, Paolo. So they are different samples, but they're going to get you the exact same late. Okay. So why are they going to get you the exact same late? Okay. Well, there's this control group, and I agree with you. There's going to have lots of people who aren't interested in there, but none of those people are going to take it up if offered. Okay. So we got a bunch of controls who don't do anything. So who are the people who are in this treatment group? And we got to compare everybody over here, everybody over here. Who are the ones who are going to get the treatment? Well, the only ones who are going to get the treatment are the ones who are interested and eligible, right? So over here, we're going to be comparing sort of a change for the interested and eligible group, and no change for the not interested or not eligible group, to some kind of weighted average with the same proportions of interested and eligible people, but with no treatment effect. So the only difference between this group and this group is the interested and eligible people get the treatment, and the controls do not. And the interested and eligible controls do not get the treatment. Otherwise, these are the same. And over here, it's exactly the same set of people. We're taking the interested and eligible, and we're comparing the ones who get the treatment and the ones who don't. Now, we have a bunch of a bunch of people in this sample. We have a bunch of people who are in the treatment group who are not eligible or not interested, who don't get treated, and we have the analogous people in the control, and that's why we have to use IV, right? If you compare just the reduced form estimates, they would be different because you got all these people who aren't doing anything, but the relevant set of compliers is exactly the same. Yes.
So then is the difference?
I'm sorry. Let me say one last thing. Under the assumption that being offered the treatment and turning it down, over here, is no different than being asked over here. So under that assumption, they are identical. Sorry, Rick, go ahead.
Okay, so then is the difference that on the right-hand side, you're just ex ante throwing away a bunch of people that could have otherwise been in your estimate?
Useless people. You're throwing away useless people on the right-hand side. So you're I mean, by useless, I mean obviously, sorry, useless for the point of view of estimating this regression. They have many wonderful uses in the world, obviously. But for the point of this view of this regression, they are just nuisance. They are people who are in your treatment group and in your control group, but who are never takers, right? So they're just in, but the problem is, in this design, in the control group, you don't know who the never takers are, right? So we can't drop them. We have to include them in the treatment group and the control group. Sorry, what were you saying? So yes. So what this design allows you to do is figure out who the never takers are and drop them from the sample. And in this design, you can't do that because I don't know who. I know who the never takers are in the treatment arm, but I don't know who the comparable never takers are in the control arm. So I have to include all of them in the treatment group and all of them in the control group for them to be comparable. Yeah, Aaron.
I guess one question on this though is from the standpoint of experimental design and thinking ex ante. We're doing this on the right-hand side. We're doing this randomization before we talk to any villages about their level of interest. So there's a risk that we do this treatment assignment, and then we go and there's 2 villages that are that are actually interested in taking up, and then
Which one? On the right-hand side?
on the right-hand side, right?
Yeah.
So that's just like I guess separate from this issue of who are never takers. There's I guess this falls into the bucket of power, but like you're running the risk that based on how you've constrained yourself from the start of the experiment, like you might.
You might not have enough people. Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
Whereas that's not an issue.
That's also true. Yeah.
On the left side.
Yeah. Okay, so does everyone agree? Yeah, comment.
Just like continuing on what Erin said, is maybe like in the right hand side, like it makes less sense because it would be more expensive and you're including people that you shouldn't include. But if you're doing the left hand side, maybe you should be careful to see how many people opt in, because maybe like you think you find an effect, but it was only for people that were interested in that in the country.
No, sorry, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. Sorry. Say it
And
again.
so I guess like in terms of external validity, you have to be careful with the first version, because maybe not enough people would be interested.
No, external validity is the same. So external validity is identical here. That's what I was saying. You get the same late. So the late may not, going back to your earlier point, the late may not be the late of like, what would the late be if I like, asked this, if I was able to persuade everyone to do this program, but the lates in the left-hand design and late in the right-hand design are the same.
I think Sal's saying is, what if just very few people in the country are interested?
Yeah.
And then at least you like see that not much is happening in the right-hand side, and then on the left-hand side you're like, oh wow, in these 4 villages that were interested, like something happens, but then.
No, but you know that too. You know that you have this information over here. You know what fact people are interested.
Yeah, I was just saying that you have to take that into account and not just like continue without taking.
Yes, you certainly have to take it into account, absolutely. But you know that piece of data you get in the same both designs. Yeah.
So on the right-hand side, if you were to then go to all the control villages and inform them, and then be like, "Are you interested?" But then just like do nothing. Do these become the same again?
Well, the problem is in reality you can't do it's not quite credible. If you're going to inform them and then be like, "Oh, sorry, you're not going to get it," like the question is like, you have to be able to you want to basically inform them in exactly an identical way. So it's not the same to say, "Are you interested?" and if so, we're going to do the program today, versus hypothetically speaking, if we did this program, would you be interested in it? Those are different questions.
Well, couldn't you ask the one on the? I see. And then you'd have to ask the same question to the people.
And that gets you to the left-hand side.
Wait. If you were asking people on the right-hand side and
Yeah.
the left wing,
Yeah.
hypothetically, like if we had this program, would you be interested?
Yeah.
And then also asking the right-hand side, but it is the same thing.
Yeah, but that is the left-hand design.
Yes, yeah. They do the same thing, right? As
Yeah.
long as you're measuring that on
Yeah,
the
then
right wing of the alternative.
If you do it in exactly the same way,
Yeah.
then that's this design.
Right.
Yes. Okay. So does everyone agree? So they're both valid internally. They actually get you the same late. Okay. So which is better? Are they equal, or is there like a strict version of a strict one that's better or worse? Someone else. Somebody else. I haven't heard from him. But what do you think? Yeah.
I mean, my intuition is we were estimating the exact same thing. We would rather have OLS than IB.
Why?
IB standard errors are always much larger because you're like essentially dividing 2 estimates by each other. So like the asymptotics get. I don't have a concrete metrics argument for you.
Yeah. What were you going to say about it?
I was in because of the sort of power argument.
Yeah. So yes, you're right. So yes, your power is going to be greater in this one and this one. And one sort of reasonable way to think about your power is that your power is like your power in an IV. Like you can sort of think about it, your statistical power as sort of like the t-test on the reduced form, right? And the t-test on the reduced, because like in some sense, both cases you're estimating a reduced form, and in the IV you take the reduced form and divide it by the first stage. But in some sense, your power is never going to be better than the reduced form. Your sort of statistical precision is never going to be better than it. Your t-stat is never going to be better than the reduced form t-stat, because you're taking that and then dividing it by something that's not perfectly estimated. So, which of these has a better t-stat, like on the reduced form? Well, here. So sorry, I probably have to write this down. So on the right-hand side, let's suppose that fraction alpha are interested. And beta is the treatment effect. So what's my t-stat? My t-stat is going to be, for the right-hand side, I don't care about this because I'm only sort of restricting my sample to people who are interested. So sorry, my t-stat is going to be rough, and n is the total sample, total number of villages. So what's my t-stat? It's roughly going to be proportional to beta divided by alpha, the square root of alpha times n. So your standard error is proportional to the, so t-stat is beta divided by the standard error. Standard error is proportional to the square root of the sample size. So my sample size I've reduced by alpha, right? Because I had to, but I multiplied by alpha because all who aren't interested, I chucked them out. So my reduced form t-stat looks something like this. Now, I'm sorry, this is the left-hand side. Now on the right-hand side version, my t-stat is going to be roughly equal to, well, I got everybody in there, but only a fraction alpha of them have a treatment, right? So it's roughly equal to alpha times beta, and I have the full sample, okay? So you can see that this one, did I do this right? I did something wrong. Hold on. No. My standard error is proportional to 1 over the square root of n, the sample size. Sorry. Bigger sample size means a smaller standard error. Yeah. There we go. Sorry, that's correct. Okay? So what is this? This is proportional to root alpha beta over root n. No, times root n. And this one is proportional to alpha beta times the square root of n. So the t-stat is going to be much bigger on the left-hand side, on the left-hand version rather than the right-hand version. Because, and why? It's because of the question of, do I want to sort of reduce my power? Like, I have the same kind of alpha problem, and do I want to deal with it by just sort of having a larger standard, by reducing the first stage, or by reducing sort of, or dealing with it with more sample size? And the answer is, because of this square root of n thing, your power is going to be left better if you can sort of deal with it up front, rather than just have to estimate it. Is that clear? No? Kailash, you look confused. No?
Yeah, sorry, why is that? Why are we comparing alpha and when we have the same sample size though?
No. So in this example, so remember I said, suppose we had 1,000 villages over here.
Okay, it's not like 1,000 villages to work with in the experiment.
I have 1,000 villages total that I can work with. And my question is, do I want to sort of screen them out ex post, or screen them ex ante, or screen them out ex post? Same 1,000 villages. And my point is that, so it's even better, by the way, if I have 1,000 villages to survey, that's like way, way better over here, right? Because I don't even have to, then it's just like, beta over, beta times root 1,000, and over here it's like, beta times, whatever, alpha root 1,000 or whatever. So it's like, or alpha beta times root 1,000. So it's like way better. If I can survey this interval, it's way better. I was making a harder case for myself where I only have a fixed number of villages up front. And my question is, and so there's a cost on the left-hand side of having a smaller sample over here. And I'm saying even then, even with like a smaller sample, a smaller amount of data, I still want the left-hand design. Yeah.
Wait, so can this intuitively be thought of as on the right-hand side, you are needing to estimate alpha, whereas on the left-hand side, you don't need to estimate alpha?
No, I think it's not just that. No, because I know alpha.
I see.
It's not that. The problem.
You know?
Yeah, because you know how many people took per treatment. So like alpha
On
just.
the right hand side?
No, it's statistically the same. So
I see, I see.
yeah.
Okay.
So the
It would be noisier, right?
yeah, but I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is, like, I think really where this comes from is on the right-hand side. I don't know who the compliers are and who the never takers are, and I have to lump them all in together. Whereas on the left-hand side, I know who the never takers are for sure, and I just get rid of them from my sample, and that's where I think the real efficiency gains are coming from. Okay, clear? So so that's why it is always a good idea, if you're ever doing this, to do as much screening as you can up before the randomization, so that your first stage, conditional on randomizing people into treatment and control, your first stage is as close to 1 as possible. Like, it's always better to sort of do that screening ex ante. Or in general, it is better. Gosh, clearly I'm talking a lot because my computer keeps like turning on. So my final question that I wanted to ask, and you know, it's as I said, writing exam questions that people seem confused about is a good diagnostic for things that should be taught in lecture. I try to avoid doing that, but every once in a while it happens. My final question is there a reason that you would prefer the right-hand design? And I will try to get my computer back so it can show you the right-hand design in a second. So I just told you all the reasons the left-hand side design is better, because it gets you the same internal validity, the same external validity, but much better power. Is there a reason you prefer the left-hand design? Yeah, Paolo, what do you think? Oh, no, sorry, prefer the right. Is there a reason you prefer the right? Sorry.
You do half as much screening, and so your cost will basically be.
Yeah, exactly. So if it turns out that the screening step is super duper expensive, right, then you might want the left-hand design. Right? Because here on the left, I got to screen everybody. And on the right, I only screen the treatment group. So if it turns out that like that step is, so the other thing you have to do in practicing experimental design is you have different costs at different levels. So there's like a screening cost, and there's like a data collection cost. And sometimes your data collection is really expensive. Like I'm going door to door and running a survey, that's really expensive. Sometimes your data collection is free. Like if you're getting admin data and like you can just get all of it like for free, like there's no cost there, and actually maybe screening people is costly. So in practice, like if the total number n here is, you know, maybe large, but these different steps have different costs, then you have to sort of think through the cost in this, and that's I think the one caveat I would make to this. Okay, clear? Questions? Okay. All right, so that's mostly what I want to say about the experimental design, and I thought this was a nice example. Okay. Okay, back to land reform. Back to land titling. Substantive. Okay. So what do they show? Okay. So they have a first stage. So even here, by the way, their first stage is not or the impact on sort of clear borders or whatever is not 1. So going through this whole process only increases it by a third or whatever, or by a quarter. That's fine. It is whatever. But then they actually do look like they find some impacts on things on tree planting and perennial crops. And the idea is these are things with very long time horizons, right? So I plant a tree, like I need to know that like A, I'm going to still own this land when it's time to like collect the crops from the tree, and B, no one is going to come and cut down my tree. And so that requires kind of pretty good property rights and clear borders. And so same thing with perennial crops kind of come back year after year. So these things suggest that sort of the clear property rights actually do change my time horizon, and that they lead people to sort of like take these longer term investments. And so that shows one type of inefficiency from having like unclear borders. Okay? Clear? Questions? All right. So that was number 1, substantively, remembering. This was investment increases with good property rights. So because of this time horizon point, investments sort of are I pay a fixed cost now, hoping to get returns in the future. If I own the thing, I'm going to get capture those returns. By the way, even if I sell it, I still capture the returns at the sale price. So I make these longer term investments. Great. Second question is, do I have to do inefficient actions in order to protect my property rights if they're less clear? Okay, so if my property rights are bad, maybe I have to do things inefficiently to sort of like protect the property rights, whereas if I give you better property rights, I can sort of not take those inefficient actions. So here are some examples. So this is one from Ghana, where people have weak property rights on plots. There are competing kind of claims to the land, like whatever, this lineage thing in the village, and it's never quite clear, as they argue in the paper, whether you have the right to farm this land or not. It's unclear. And in particular, so as you may know, you want to leave your land fallow or sort of not sort of farm it every so many years to allow the land to kind of regenerate itself. But the problem is, if I'm not actively farming the land, someone else may say, well, that land, no, you're not using that land. I'm going to take that land. And so in this context, the idea is that fallowing your land is a risky thing to do if you have insecure property rights. And so the idea here is what they want to say is people who have power in this relationship or in this area, they're the ones who are less worried about their property rights. It's not kind of a land titling paper. It just sort of says in this event of sort of like, if I'm sort of really powerful in the village, I'm not really worried you're going to take my land because like I can boot you out if you did that. But if I'm not very powerful, then that's a real risk for me. And what they argue is that the people who are not powerful don't fallow their land as much for this reason. Okay, so that's the argument of the paper. So they show, for example, that like office holders don't sort of fallow their land. People who hold do fallow their land. Inherited people fallow their land. So I'm not going to go through that in a lot of detail. I think the question you want to think about if you're thinking with this paper is like, what is this correlated with, and what are the admitted variables? And let me not go into that. If you're interested, you can read the paper. But the point is, this is one potential example of a kind of inefficient action people could take. Another one that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail is this paper by Field in Peru. This is a land titling paper. So in this period, basically, they rapidly start issuing titles, and these are actually going to be urban households. Okay, so you can think of people like in kind of like less formal areas, maybe in slum areas, who don't really have clear title over their land. So they're going to go through and title all these places, and they want to say, does just the act of getting that title and having that clear property rights mean that you no longer have to like stick around the house to sort of protect your house? Okay, that's kind of the idea. And it's going to be a diff and diff, basically. Okay, so in this paper, so it's like basically like areas that get the title is diff and diff. Areas that get the titling program versus areas that don't get the titling program or haven't had it yet, and people who had titles to begin with who shouldn't be affected versus kind of the ones who were untitled to begin with, right? So that's kind of the diff and diff. So lo and behold, the titling program gives you a title. Probability 0.78. That says the program kind of worked. Does it sort of, it kind of reduces your risk of eviction or property invasion substantially, at least your perceived risk. So it looks like people are sort of updating about their risks based on sort of titles, and so forth. Or do I consider it secure? That goes up. So in general, it seems like this is sort of changing people's security about their houses. And the question kind of is, what does this do to their sort of labor market outcomes? And in particular, what you can see is so what happens is they end up kind of more in the labor force. But I think what's more interesting is kind of why. And in particular, these kind of things are, I think, actually, to me, the two most interesting results. They're sort of, am I using my residence for my economic activity? Do I kind of have to work from home because I need to be home to kind of protect the house? That goes down with titling. And do people have kind of really long commutes? Are they kind of going really far away for work? That actually goes up. So this is an urban space where people aren't actually sort of selling their land. And this is not a case where sort of the title let me sold a house and move somewhere else. What this case is doing is sort of saying, there are good opportunities really far away in this big metro area, but I have to kind of leave my house kind of alone for the day and be confident it's going to be there when I come back. And they show that goes up kind of with better titles. Okay, and so the implication of that also is that the titling was causing an inefficiency. The lack of titling was causing an inefficiency because people weren't able to. These were jobs they clearly prefer by revealed preference, but weren't able to sort of do because they were worried about protecting their houses. Yeah.
So there's some methods, but in general, when we study land reform or tendering, like, is plot level data very critical to this type of thing? Like, can you draw extrapolation for some, I don't know, average productivity for like a...
Yeah, so it's a power question. So, you know, could you run, suppose this thing was randomized, so we didn't have to worry about pre-trends or any of that stuff. So we just had like title areas, non-title areas. If you had enough of them, you could just compare in general what happens in the titled areas, what happens in the non-titled areas. I'm thinking. Actually, the ideal thing, I think, would be to say either sort of at the house level or at the person level, and follow. And the place where it's a little complicated is if you have. So you either want to track what's happening to houses as kind of a unit, or what's happening to people kind of as a unit. What you might not want to do is track like people in location. So you might not want to just kind of do a cross-sectional ex-post interview of kind of who happens to be in that house at the time, because that could be because people could swap back and forth between the places. So you see what I'm saying? So I think what you really want to do is
House is okay as houses.
yeah, I mean it's a thing. Like what happens to, then you're asking kind of questions about the land, right? And that's yes. I mean, with the caveat, the whole city is kind of operating in general equilibrium. So, you know, in even better cases, if you have kind of like isolated cities that are kind of like separate from each other. So if the city, if you're in a world where the city is in, so for people, I think you're in good shape. Ex-ante people tracking them over time, that's fine. No, I guess if the city is in equilibrium, that's fine too. Actually, you're gonna get kind of what is the. I think the city actually that's probably okay, because in the pre-period when they're not titled, you're gonna read off kind of what is the difference of the marginal return to this property being titled or not. So that's still valid too. But yes, I think you do want to think through kind of if you're asking kind of these equilibrium questions, what are the sort of equilibrium things moving around? Okay, other questions? Yeah.
In these kind of things, why don't you see more insurance structures?
More what?
More insurance company maybe rising, maybe provided by the powerful individuals to provide
Insurance.
Yeah. Property like if you go away, I'll guarantee like no one's gonna take over it, and if they do, I'll give you some money for it.
It's a good question. So that's actually really interesting. So I don't know. I mean, and you do hear about like protection payments, for example. You know, by informal, often they end up being like by gangs and things. Which are maybe better able to be in the business. The problem is the formal sector can't really do it because you don't have the formal title. So it becomes really tricky to sort of like be like, well, I don't like. What are you like doing this thing through the formal? I think providing this kind of insurance through the formal sector is difficult if you don't have title, because the formal sector needs paperwork basically. So I don't know of any. I could be wrong. I don't know of any examples of the formal sector providing insurance against evictions for like for people who don't have formal title. I could be wrong, and that would be super interesting actually if you found examples of that. I do think there are all these informal institutions, like gangs, for example, which on the one hand are just taxing people, so they're providing so a lot of those payments are just pure straight rent extraction, but they sometimes are offering services in exchange for that. And because they kind of operate kind of more informally, they can maybe enforce these things kind of more informally. I don't know of any examples where informal institutions like that are providing either kind of good property protection against sort of expropriation or insurance. But I think that would be if you found one, that would be super interesting to study. I think it'd be super cool. Yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely. Other questions or comments? Okay. All right. So number 3 in our list of sort of like what are the problems with poor property rights is misallocation, which I think somebody asked about. So in principle, right, tradable property rights should lead to efficiency improvements. Like that's kind of the Coase theorem. As an aside, we have a student, a current grad student now who's actually working on some of this stuff in the context of fisheries and tradable fishing permits, and like exactly kind of asking these kind of Coase theorem questions. What about land? So this is another paper where I'm sort of looking for like a great land coast theorem paper. I'm going to tell you about two that are sort of relevant, but I don't think quite, have exactly what we want here. But let me tell you the two papers that I know of that sort of think about this. And I'm also, I should say, by the way, I'm always open to like, oh, Ben, you forgot about this paper, like, so if there are papers I should be aware of, you should always let me know. There's a lot to keep track of. So one paper that is not particularly well known, but I happen to like it because I think it asks a very clear question, is this paper by Ravalian and Van de Waal about Vietnam. So Vietnam was like a strict communist country at one point, and then sort of had a bunch of reforms and sort of relaxed some of that and allowed sort of more things that look more like ownership properties. So in particular, they're going to study the introduction of private tradable land in Vietnam. So it used to be like the land was allocated by the government, couldn't be traded, and then it becomes tradable. And they want to argue that basically after privatization, what happens is the high productivity farmers end up with kind of more land, which is what you'd expect in sort of a standard kind of coast theorem logic, right? I'm a good farmer, you're a bad farmer, I should buy your land. To some point, right? If there's kind of concave, right? If land productivity is concave in size, then I shouldn't necessarily buy all the land, but like on the margin, like we see an allocation of the if we all have the same amount of land, the marginal productivity of the good farmers would be lower than the low farmers, so that's not an equilibrium. We should have more land to the equilibrium where we equalize marginal products of land should have more land for the higher farmers under standard kind of models. So how do they do this? Well, they do this kind of structurally, and they say in the pre-period they estimate some characteristics that make you kind of a more productive farmer. Then they write down a functional form where basically they have this kind of C function, which is sort of saying that the C function is sort of the productivity function is a function of how much land you have and how much and these X characteristics, and they write it down parametrically like this in logs, which means that in levels these things are complements. Okay, so people with more X should have more L in that functional form. Okay, and so if this B coefficient is concave, is less than 1, this is concave in land, and we get the interior solution, what I basically just described, that basically you have the people with better X's are the ones getting more land, but they don't get all the land. And so they then test whether land allocations increase with this kind of predicted optimal amount of land, which is all a function of their X's. So I think this is a very sort of like structural kind of approach to this. It requires getting these X's kind of right, and it also requires kind of other emitted variables that are kind of correlated with these X's. So I don't think this is perfect. For example, there could be other things, like for example, the X's might influence the production function. Like if I'm like politically connected, maybe I look like I'm a good farmer because I can sell at high prices, and maybe I also get some output. Other things could be changing besides property rights. It's kind of just like a diff, essentially. It's a different diff by the L star thing, but there could be other things that are changing that change the allocation of land. A big one is actually their outcome. The reason this is the C, this is actually its consumption, not production. So that's a little weird. It's not necessarily what you want, and it's very functional form production. So very functional form dependent. It's very, very simple functional form. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but I think that though in principle, though, this is a cool idea to sort of say, look, here's what the efficient allocation would look like. We relax property rights over here, not over here. If we had that extra diff, does the allocation move kind of more in the direction of kind of more to the sort of the high TFP kind of focus? Yes, Kailash.
What would be like a less structural approach to answer this? Like, what's the kind of objective?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe it's not so much that it's structural. Maybe it's all these data issues and not having a second diff. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe you're right. At some level, you're right. You do have to estimate. Well, one thing I could do, for example, is I could not project it on X's.
Sorry, how does that work?
So, yeah, okay, fine. It's a very fair question. So, I could estimate individual farmer fixed characteristics and sort of say like I could just take the production function, I could estimate like a farm production function, and then have farmer fixed effects, and the farmer fixed effects is kind of your residual TFP, right? And then I could see whether individual farmers who seem more productive get more land kind of when they free it up. That would be sort of a less, that it's still parametric in that sort of I have to kind of partial out other stuff to get your piece of it. But that would be one way to do it. So another way to do it would be to, it's not perfect, it's got other downsides, but you know, to sort of say, look, I'm gonna estimate the like average productivity. I could take something simple. I could do average productivity of land. Yeah, maybe that's the same. It's the same as sort of the sexes. So maybe that's the answer. Is it, you know, so A, better data, B, an extra diff, and C, I think maybe a richer structure where I don't sort of load it all into a couple of X's. Maybe would be better. Fair question though. Fair question. Okay, so but what do you see? The basic point is the land deficit is sort of, you know, L star over, these are the people that should have more land. This is like L star over L, right? Optimal amount of land compared to actual land, and this is the change in land kind of during the reform period. So in general, it just sort of says during this sort of 5-year period, the people who we predict to get more land do actually get more land. So I think that suggests it's reallocation in the sort of productivity dimension with the kind of caveats I mentioned. The last thing I want to say for today is that this coast process, this reallocation process, can take a really long time. Okay, and here's a nice example of this. This is a paper by Bleakley and Ferry. It's called Land Openings on the Georgia Frontier and the Coast Theorem in the Short and the Long Run. So this paper studied land allocations in the US state of Georgia. And the frontier in Georgia, like this was a long time ago, if Georgia was the frontier. For those of you who know, the US was settled from approximately settled, certainly from coast to coast, mostly from east to west, with some caveats, by the colonists and so on. So the frontier was opened by the US government to settlers in waves heading west, and different waves use different parcel sizes. Okay, so at some area, I think they get like 40-acre parcels, and there they got 160-acre parcels or something like that. And there's a discontinuity, right, of the border between which are the areas where it was divided into kind of big plots and the area where it was divided into small plots. And they argue is that in the long run, plot size, if the coast theorem is true, the optimal sort of plot sizes should converge to the same thing on both sides of this border. Like there's an optimal farm size in Georgia, and you know, we should buy and sell farms to get to the optimal farm size. So the initial allocation of big farms versus small farms shouldn't matter in the long run. Okay? And the question is, how long is the long run? That is the question of this paper. Okay? And the answer is the long run is about 100 years. Okay? So they trace kind of the parcel size across this border for like you know, over time, and it doesn't really kind of converge till, you know, almost 100 years later. So I just want to say that the coast theorem works, but the coast theorem is slow, was kind of the point I want to make. So just worth keeping in mind as well. OK, I'm out of time. I'll stop here. I'll just finish up the last few things about land. The paper I'm going to start with very briefly next time is I'll talk a little bit about this Foster and Rosenzweig paper if you want to have a quick look at it, and then we'll switch to the, I think the PF lectures are next on redistribution, are the next ones. So that's what's coming next. Okay, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.